Hey guys, I'm Matt from SBFishingTV here with 𝗙𝗙𝗋𝗶𝗹. Today we're going to be taking a look at 4 different kinds of jigs and where to fish them, how to fish them, why to fish them, and hopefully catch some big old bass on them. Alright guys, so there are a ton of different jigs out there that you can fish, but today we're going to take a look at 4 specific jigs, starting with the Flippin Jig. We also have a football head jig, a finesse football head jig, and then the swim jig. So we're going to take a quick look at the Flippin Jig first. So this is exclusive to 𝗙𝗋𝗋𝗶. This is 𝗙𝗋𝗋𝗋's Flippin Jig. As you guys can see, it has that really nice archy head styled pour, has a really sharp hook, and it's pretty stout as well. This is the jig you're going to be throwing around the tightest cover and grass that you can find, and you're going to be just weaving it in and out of all of that wood cover, rock, grass, whatever it may be. But this is the one that you're going to be throwing on your flipping stick. So I'm throwing this on a 7/6 extra heavy rod with 20-pound fluorocarbon and a high speed gear ratio reel. So the reason you need a high speed gear ratio reel is when you're flipping and pitching and really just working your way down the bank. When those fish hit this jig, they're generally going to run with it super quick, and you also want to be able to pull them out of any sort of tight cover that you're getting yourself into. Next up, we have the Perfection Lures football head jig. Now this one is super interesting because if you guys can see there on the back, it has 2 wire stands here, so that football head jig is going to stand straight up when you're fishing this on the bottom, which is what you want with your football head jigs. This is a dragging jig, and you really just want this thing to be dragging on the bottom. So that's going to present that lure just like this. So this is going to stand up a little bit too, and it's going to keep that hook off the bottom, which is really important when you're dragging a football head jig around. So as far as the setup goes for the football head jig, I'm throwing that on a 7/6 medium heavy rod. You want the longer rod because generally when you're fishing this a little bit deeper, you're making really long casts. You want a really good hook set, and that's something else I want to tell you guys about. When you get that bite, you really want to reel down till that rod's starting to bow and then just give that fish the hammer. So unlike the Flippin Jig, the football head jig is something I'm going to be fishing a little bit deeper, and I'm not fishing this nearly as fast as the Flippin Jig. So this is something you're going to want to drag around points, docks, and any sort of offshore structure that you can find. So taking a step back from the full-size football head jig, we are going to take a look at the heavy metal tungsten football head jig. So this one's just a little bit smaller. It's still a ½ ounce in size, but since it's tungsten, you can see the head there is way smaller. Quick comparison for you guys. So both of those jigs are a ½ ounce, and this one's significantly smaller. If this was lead, it would probably be about a ¼ ounce. But another thing about the finesse jig is it's going to have a lighter wired hook. So I'm going to pick the finesse jig up if the jig bite seems to slow down a little bit and they still want to eat something on the bottom, but something with a smaller profile. So I always like to throw small creature baits on the back of my finesse football head jig. So you can see I have a hog styled bait on there. Generally, if I'm fishing dirty water, I like to dye the tips of the tails a little bit too. And with this, I'm going to fish on a little bit lighter line and smaller rod. So this is a 7-foot medium heavy, and I'm fishing that on 15-pound fluorocarbon. So last but not least, we have the swim jig. So this is the 6th Sense Divine swim jig. One thing you'll notice that's different from the swim jig from a Flippin Jig or a football head jig is that it has a vertical line tie. So that's going to help you from getting stuck in any sort of cover when you're swimming it along, whether that's grass or wood. This thing is one of my favorite baits to throw around thick grass. I have this rigged up with an Exo Swim by Biospawn, and this bait just is killer around grass. You can fish it around wood as well, but it really shines around the grass. I'm throwing this on a 7-foot medium heavy rod, fast action, and 20-pound fluorocarbon line. So all 4 of these jigs, you know, they all have their time and place. So now that we've gone over each of these jigs and how they're a little bit different from each other and how I'd throw them differently, we're going to get up, flip a little bit with the Flippin Jig, see if we can catch some fish. I'm sure a lot of you guys are going to ask me, when is the best time to throw a jig? So I'll actually throw a jig all year round, but generally when it's winter getting into spring, I really start to pick them up once that water hits about 50 to 55 degrees. So when we're throwing jigs, we're imitating crawfish for the most part. Unless we're throwing the swim jig, then we're trying to imitate a small shad or bluegill. But when it comes to fishing the jig as a crawfish imitator, crawfish generally will come out of their winter haunts when that water hits 55 degrees. So that's when I'll pick that jig up and just start catching giants. Springtime is my favorite time to throw a jig. You know, fishing really fast, shallow, heavy cover. These fish that are just nosed into big trees that are downed, or really heavy grass on the shoreline that's starting to grow. Those are really good key spots to look for, especially when you're fishing the flippin' jig around a bit. When it comes to fishing football head jigs, that's something I'm going to fish generally a little bit deeper. I think post-spawn is when they really start to shine, when those fish are done spawning and they're starting to work their way toward their summer haunts. You know, fish long tapering points, sharp tapering points, bluff walls, and any sort of deep water that's close to spawning flats. Pick up that football head jig, back that boat off like 20 yards from where you've been fishing in the spring, and just drag it around those break lines. The head on the football head jig, while it's really good around rock and deeper wood, when you're trying to flip shallow shoreline cover, whether that's grass or wood, the head being so big does tend to get stuck a little bit more. So now that we've gone over all these jigs, we're gonna get up and flip the flippin' jig around a little bit, and then maybe move off, see if we can catch some of the deeper fish with the football head jigs. All right guys, so we're gonna start the day off with flipping around the 𝗙𝗹𝗹𝗶 flippin' jig around. I've been finding these fish really shallow in the backs of creeks, so we're gonna target all the wood and grass that we can find and just flip really tight cover with this thing, cover as much water as we can, and try to get some big old bass to bite. So quick tip for you guys. I've been doing this a lot lately, is when I'm in dirtier water, I've been dyeing the tips of my jig trailers. A little bit of chartreuse. Gives it a little bit of extra pop. I think these fish hold on a little bit longer to that too. So when it comes to the flippin' jig, I'm fishing it pretty fast. Covering a lot of water. I'm really just looking for that fish to hit it on the initial fall. So something you really should pay attention to is your line. You can see like a quick little snap in your line or a pop. That's usually a fish, or you hit something on the way down, but a lot of the times if you watch your line, you'll see those bites before you even feel them. You'll also see your line just taking off sometimes. Like if you casted there at that tree, by the time you reel down, your line's over here. That is a fish, my friends. As you can see, you can flip it into this real nasty stuff. That's why you need a real heavy powered rod and strong line too. It's going to help you get those fish out of that stuff. So for the most part, I'm just making quick little flips in, letting it sink on a slack line straight down. That might have been a bite. Nope. I just hit something. That's exactly what I was talking about. I saw my line kind of tick. A lot of the times that's a fish, but sometimes you hit a branch or something. So as I was just saying, a lot of the times I'll just make a quick flip in, let it fall right to the bottom. If I don't get bit on that initial fall, I'll just give it a few hops, trying to keep it around that cover as much as possible. So if there's any fish that are around and they see it or didn't see it fall in initially, they'll come out and strike it. But I'm not spending too much time on one cast. So I flipped my way out of this cove. I flipped into the tightest cover that I could find, but this is one of the situations where you get to the mouth of the cove where you might want to switch from a flippin' jig over to the football jig. So we have a really nice windy point right here, so I'm going to spend a minute, throw this jig out here and just drag it along this deeper break line of water and just see if I can get any of those fish that have yet to move up. Hopefully we'll catch a big one on this football head jig. So the football head jig works really, really well in deep water. It's one of my favorite things to throw on points post-spawn. And also during the spawn when the fish haven't fully moved up yet and you want to get out on those points in those transition areas for those fish to move up. The football head jig is a great one to be throwing around. So I'm just making really long casts with this, and then I'm just slowly dragging it just like this. You want it to stay on the bottom, keeping contact the entire time, or as long as you can. Just drag it all the way back to the boat. This one is much slower fishing than the flippin' jig, but it'll definitely pick you up some really, really big fish. So normally if I'm throwing a flippin' jig, I'm gonna have the boat about 10 yards closer to the bank so I can fish everything that's shoreline cover oriented. But since I'm throwing the football head jig right now, I'll keep the boat about 10 yards back and I'm fishing that first break line. It's a perfect spot to throw a football head jig. You just want to drag it right over that edge see if there's any fish holding there. Also, when you come up to any sort of cover when you're throwing the football head jig, as soon as I hit it, I like to just kill the jig. And then once you kill it for a second, if you don't get bit there, I like to just bump it right into that wood cover a few times. Sometimes you can get a good reaction strike from that. If they see the jig just bouncing right into that wood, they'll come up and smoke it. If you don't get bit that way, sometimes another thing you can do when you pull up to cover is kind of pop it over top of it and then let it sit on the other side, so those fish are going to see it bounce off or rip off of that wood, and they'll come eat it. So we've gone over the football head jigs and the flippin' jig, so let's get into the swim jig really quickly. So this is really going to shine in the grass. We do have some shallow shoreline grass coming in here where I'm fishing, so I'm going to try to just zip this up the bank and slowly pull it through there. But this works really well around, you know, 𝗙𝗲𝗋𝗶𝗶 or hydrilla or any sort of shallow water grass that you can find. That's my favorite place to throw swim jigs. And you know, you can still throw it around wood, but I'd rather be flipping a flippin' jig around the wood and this around the grass. So keep that in mind. We're going to give this a shot for a little bit. You can see that I have some shoreline grass. So I'm making casts up into that grass and I'm just slowly swimming it out, and I'm basically fishing this thing exactly like I would a spinnerbait. The only difference is I might add a little bit more action to it with the rod than I would a spinnerbait, but that's just to counteract not having any blades on it for the most part. So again, I'm casting it straight up onto the bank and just working it through that grass. I know there are fish sitting right on the edge of that grass, so this thing should get bit. And again, just small little hops with the rod just to give it a little bit more action. So this is another jig I like to throw in really clean water. We do have a bit of a stain on the water today, but it still might work because the fish are so shallow. The first 3 feet off the bank is a little bit clean. It's not too bad. There we go. All right, little guy on the swim jig, but we'll take him. Absolute dink, but you guys can see this swim jig, I mean, pretty big compared to that fish, but he just couldn't resist it. So that's the 𝗙𝗃𝗋𝗶 with the 6th Sense Divine swim jig for you. I really like this swim jig for 2 reasons. One, it has a really nice fluorocarbon weed guard, and 2, it has a really nice screw lock for your trailers, so you're not constantly messing with that when you're out fishing. It just stays on there taut really, really well. But that's a great jig right there. That was awesome. There we go. Oh yeah. Awesome. It's a good fish on the swim jig. Alright guys, there you go. It's about a 2.5 pound fish. Caught it on the 6th Sense Divine swim jig. Right now I'm just paralleling this bank, making casts parallel with the grass line and pulling it straight out onto the edge, and as soon as that jig got onto the outside of that grass line, this fish thumped it. But I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. That's going to be it for me today. Make sure you pick up some jigs, get out there this spring and catch some big old donkey bass. See y'all on the next one.